Hello everyone and welcome to this edition of the Middle East Today, coming to you from Beirut. I'm Mariam Saleh. An estimated 1,600 to 2,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails continue an open-ended mass hunger strike, which began on April 17th to protest against Israel's administrative detention rules, the use of solitary confinement and maltreatment of sick detainees. The International Committee of the Red Cross has called for hospitalization of 6 Palestinian hunger strikers who are being held in Israeli prisons. The Israeli group, also Physicians for Human Rights, has condemned the court's decision of turning down an appeal requesting the release of 2 prisoners who began their hunger strike back in February. Now, protests in support of the prisoners continue in Gaza and the West Bank, while many have criticized the Arab League for not taking this matter to the United Nations Security Council. Now, to get more on what's happening to the prisoners right now, I am joined by Professor Mohsen Saleh from the Zaytouna Center for Studies. He's joining me here in Beirut. I'm also joined by Ms. Karen Gold, journalist, joining us via satellite in London. We're also joined by Mr. Isam Yunus, director of Al Mizan Center for Human Rights. He's joining us from Gaza. And let me begin with you, Mr. Yunus. Since you're following up the issue, we heard from the Red Cross saying that the prisoners are in imminent danger of death. What can you tell us about their situation?
I think the situation is very complicated and very difficult at the moment. Now we are counting not by days, by hours and minutes. Prisoners are now in their hunger strike. So far, the Israeli prison service did not respond positively to their legitimate demands. Their health conditions are very difficult, very complicated, and I think there are all reasons to be worried about their situation. And I'm saying that as long as there isn't that international intervention to put an end for the Israeli unlawful, unhuman treatment vis-à-vis the prisoners, I think the worst yet to come. And we are very afraid that the next hours will be of significant consequence on the prisoners' lives in the Israeli prisons.
Yes, well, can you tell us about most of these prisoners, their situation? Were most of them taken prisoner after they were released, with the latest prisoner swap between Hamas and Israel, or were these people that were still in jails for the past few years and continue to be there under administrative detention?
Yes, I mean, now back to the question why prisoners went in a hunger strike. I think it's very clear. There are policies that cannot be tolerated anymore by the Palestinian prisoners. Prisoners have gained some basics that were a result of a direct struggle by them all the years long of their detention in the Israeli prisons. The policy of administrative detention, which is detaining Palestinians without any charges, is a very notorious policy, and it cannot be tolerated anymore. And Palestinian prisoners has decided not to tolerate it and to accept it anymore. So many of the Palestinians are administratively detained. Many are in solitary confinement. They were isolated from other colleagues, other prisoners, and they live in a very, very dire conditions in the Israeli prisons. Palestinian prisoners from Gaza were denied visits for the last 7 years by their families, by their relatives. They did not even pay any single visit. The conditions in general are very, very complicated, and there are many prisoners who are either some of them has been rearrested by the Israelis, those who were released in the recent swab, the Shalit swab. Mm-hmm. Many of the prisoners are in a very serious health conditions, suffer from many illnesses.
Right.
And that's why I'm saying the situation is very, very difficult and cannot be tolerated. And we're talking about violations of basic principles of international law and violation
Yes.
of the minimum standards for the treatment of prisoners, the United Nations minimum standards. The situation is very serious. That's why, again, I'm saying now hours are very serious,
Yes.
minutes are very serious, and we count it on that level.
Yes, of course. Before I come back to our studio, let me ask Ms. Gold about the issue of administrative detention specifically. Israel upholds a British colonial law, which existed back then, that they have the right to detain Palestinians without trial or charge. Why does Israel keep this law specifically against Palestinians?
Yes, you refer to a very, very old law, which goes back to the time of the Mandate, which was actually used against Jewish settlers, against the Jews who were trying to make a home in Israel. And the British authorities cracked down on Jewish settlers many, many times using the facility of administrative detention. Eventually, this led to the bombing of the King David Hotel, although there were many other reasons for that. I think it is a great tragedy that earlier this week Benjamin Netanyahu called elections, as would in any democracy, I put that in quotes, and suddenly yesterday he announced there isn't going to be an election, and he's formed a coalition with Shaul Mofaz, the former defense minister, and there won't be elections until the end of 2013. This is the action of someone who has no interest in democracy. I have said whenever I've been on these programs on Press TV and in other places that Israel has the most right-wing government that it has ever had in its history. It's even more right-wing than the government of Ariel Sharon, who after all cleared the Jewish settlers out of Gaza. But now that we have the Netanyahu government in place, with no possibility of the left or labor or any liberal group within Israel to have a voice, then I don't see us having any end to administrative detention. There are human rights groups in Israel, including Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem, and of course the International Committee of the Red Cross, who are insisting that this administrative detention be ended. And in fact, even Justices Rubinstein, Solberg, and Danziger, who are the three justices who said that these prisoners may not be released,
Yes.
have said that the government has to reform the whole system, because these prisoners are not even being allowed someone to visit them, to talk to them about the adjudication. The Israeli government is using the excuse that it's a violation of national security for these issues to be discussed. But these issues can be discussed in camera. They can be discussed in private, but at least give the prisoners a chance to have a voice and for them to be represented. And I'm afraid that this is a situation that is just as bad as what many people describe at Guantanamo Bay, the United States detention of people for 8 to 10 years, 10, 12 years, in Guantanamo Bay without a proper trial.
All right,
So I'm afraid the Israel and the United States do not come out looking very well in this situation.
Yes, let me ask Professor Mr. Mohsen Salah, do you think that this is related to specifically the time of Benjamin Netanyahu, that there can be no reform, if we may say, on this specific issue?
Well, generally speaking, this is consistent in the Israeli policy since the occupation of Palestine in, dealing with the Palestinian prisoners, especially with this case of administrative detention. It is chronic in their policies since the occupation. So, let me say also one word. Yes, this policy was used by the British, but it was mostly used against the Palestinian nationalists who were calling for their freedom and establishing a Palestinian state, not only for some few Jews, which we have some few cases at that time. Also for the second case here, this policy was used by Likud Party, by the Labour Party, by the coalition. So it is a general, consistent Israeli policy which was used by all. And we have all over the time we have hundreds of Palestinian prisoners under such a rule, this administrative detention. Nowadays we have almost 300, but maybe at the times of the labor or the Likud we have few hundreds every time, or for the last 20 or 25 years. So it is a general consistent policy of the Israelis.
Don't you think it might somehow backfire and blow up in Israel's face as long as it's getting bigger, it's getting more intense? Although we still don't have a lot of words from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so on, and their stances are not that harsh, but people are getting angrier inside Palestine.
Well, just for information, for this policy, maybe the world will not hear about the Palestinian sufferance inside the Israeli jails unless the Palestinians go for such hunger strike or these things. But this very policy is being used since occupation since 1967, and all the suffering is there. Not only this kind of administrative detention, but even with torture. Mostly 90% of Palestinians are being tortured in the Israeli jails under all sorts of Israeli governments, and we have this, with many evidences about that. We have hundreds of children, women, and so on. So we have all the cases of kind of torture which goes against the Fourth Geneva Convention, the Third Geneva Convention, and all the international standards of human rights when dealing with prisoners. So, in fact, we have Palestinians under occupation. This occupation is cruel. Is not dealing with people based on human rights. And in such case, we have very, very big sufferance. Unfortunately, we have the support of USA and some Western countries to such Israeli policies, in which people cannot hear in the right way about the real sufferance of Palestinians in the jails. We have nowadays we have more than 4,300 Palestinians who are still in the Israeli jails.
All right, let me go back to Mr. Yunus in Gaza. What hope do the prisoners have of being released if they continue their hunger strike?
Let me return a little bit back to the British mandate regulations of 1949. I think it's very important to highlight the fact that those regulations were the occupiers' laws and were revoked when the British Army left Palestine in the year 1949. And the Israelis continued to use those laws, those extraordinary laws, those emergency laws against the Palestinians. The house demolitions, administrative detention, etc. This policy or these regulations were adopted before the adoption of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. So they are before the Geneva Conventions, namely the fourth Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons. It's in clear contradiction with the Geneva Convention. It lacks and violates basic principles of international law. So they are illegal. Whether the Israelis would claim that they are implementing what the British has left in Palestine, the emergency laws, they are not anymore. In theory, they should not be implemented. In practice, they are in violation of basic principles, and Geneva Convention is the key treaty that regulates the relation between the occupiers and the occupied. This is one thing. Second, Israel, all the years long, have violated the Geneva Convention when it comes to its relation with the prisoners. First, Israel is the only country, I think, in the world that would legalize torture as a state policy. The what's so-called physical or moderate physical pressure that was adopted by the Landau Commission in 1987 is exactly what is meant by Article 1 of the United Nations Convention against Torture, when it identified torture to be any act that would cause severe pain, whether it's mental or physical. And physical, what's so-called moderate physical pressure is in fact torture. So Israel is a state that legalizes torture. This is one thing. Second, Israel, while detaining Palestinians, according to Geneva Convention, Palestinian prisoners should be imprisoned in the occupied territories. And it's illegal to transfer them to the sovereign territory of the occupying power. this has been tolerated all the time long by the international community. As far as Israel feels that it's immune, it has this feeling that it's above the law, because there are some countries that would provide the legal and political cover for the war crimes that are committed by Israel. Just to draw your attention that the Security Council 6 or 7 months ago failed to adopt a resolution that would condemn the Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, which is a clear violation of international law. Now, by tolerating the Israeli practices all the years long in their treatment for the Palestinian prisoners, I think Israel will continue its policy of perpetrating war crimes, of perpetrating violations of the Geneva Convention, and the Palestinians should pay a very high price. There is a collective punishment. That's a violation of international law. The international community should now act. As long as Israel feels that it's immune, I think the worst yet to come, and we could expect the worst to come in a couple of hours.
Yeah, since you mentioned this issue, this is something that we hear a lot, of course, in the Arab world. Ms. Gold, tell us what you think about this. Many believe that Israel feels that it is immune of any international condemnation, especially in the United Nations Security Council, and therefore has no problem, will not stop any of its policies.
The pressure from the international community, including Mahmoud Abbas in the Palestinian Authority, putting pressure on the UN to condemn administrative detention and to condemn the fact that the West does not seem to be doing anything about these prisoners and their conditions. This is true, that you get to the Security Council and there's a certain set of nations that will always support Israel and will not support a resolution. But what I find interesting, being American, is that Barack Obama has been completely silent about this issue. When you think that there are an estimated 1,600 prisoners in one stage or other of hunger strike, Mr. Halele has been taken to an Israeli hospital, and Mr. Diab has also been on hunger strike for a long time. There is a presidential campaign going on, and what both candidates, Romney and Obama, are depending on are 70 million evangelical Christians who support Israel. Forget about the Jewish lobby. There are 6 million Jews in in the United States. 6 million Jews in the United States have no effect on the election. They are insignificant. But 70 million evangelical Christians who support Israel are the ones that a presidential candidate needs in order to be reelected. And this is why both candidates are keeping quiet on this issue.
Okay.
Also, if any country were to say to Obama, why aren't you doing something about the Palestinians? What can he say? The United States still has a large group of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay who've been there from between 8 to 11 years, and some of them have yet to be tried. So he hasn't got much to answer for. The Guantanamo Bay situation goes back to the time of Bush. But in terms of international condemnation, I would agree that there really hasn't been much. And it's not going to get very far in the United Nations.
All right, I need to ask one last question, Mr. Yunus in Gaza, before we lose him. The issue of the Arab League, I mean, what are the Palestinians asking for from the Arab League? Should they take a harsher stance? Should they have more meetings? Should they take this to the Security Council? Are they themselves also weak in this point?
Yes, I think we have very serious problem here. The Arab League should act differently. I think they should provide them with the support, legal, political, diplomatic. At least the file should be transferred to the United Nations, the General Assembly, as well as the Security Council, and a session, an emergency session, to be held by the Human Rights Council. We're talking about many rapporteurs, thematic or country rapporteurs, who should come and ask to visit the prisoners and to investigate their demands and the Israeli practices. This job or this mission should be conducted by the Arab League. The Arab League, I think, so far failed to show the needed support for the prisoners and to push forward their case. And I think as long as the international community is not intervening to alleviate their conditions and to alleviate the misery that's prevailing in the Israeli prisons, I think now the alternatives will be the Arab League should take the initiative in this regard. I think the Palestinian split has its dynamics, and I think it's one of the serious obstacles in front of strategizing and to go ahead to support the prisoners. We should stop this, and I think my message to be conveyed here, I think the prisoners issue, the hunger strike, should force the political opponents to unite and to reconsider their cases this time seriously.
All right, great. So with that in mind, let me ask Professor Saleh about this issue, the rift among the Palestinians. Do we need to have unity among them first before we can call on the Arab League to take its responsibility, if we may say, or the United Nations Security Council, or any international committee in that case?
Unity is so important for Palestinians to address their issue, but this is not the case. Palestinians are suffering from the Israeli occupation. Their women, their children, those prisoners in jails, their houses being demolished, not because whether they are having unity or not. The Israelis are an occupying force which dealing with very cruel manner with the Palestinians. And when Palestinians were united, also for a long time, the Israelis continued the very same policies against Palestinians, killing, torturing, injuring, detaining, arresting, and also seizing their land. So it is a policy of the Israelis, and in a very systematic way, in the process of Judaizing the areas of Jerusalem, all areas of West Bank, and so on. So it is a consistent policy, and in this case, we should blame those who are doing such policies, the occupiers, not the victims.
Yes, of course.
Yes,
but doesn't the Arab League
and
the Palestinian leadership on both sides, don't they also have a responsibility in this respect?
Yeah, well, they are united in the case of Palestinian prisoners. They are in one way, and they are united in addressing the issue of prisoners. They are not divided in such a case, and they are cooperating in promoting such an issue. I think it is their responsibility, the responsibility also of the Arab League, also of the organization of Islamic Council or Cooperation or Islamic League. Also, it is the responsibility of the international community, because occupation goes against the international law, against human being rights, and also against the laws of the United Nations and so on, all the international laws. So I think it is also an international responsibility. We should not go for Palestinians to blame them for this such policy here or there. It is the responsibility of the international community to force or to push the Israelis to withdraw from the Palestinian lands, and this is number one responsibility of the big powers who are supporting Israel and gave them such a cover for their cruel policies in the
Yes, do you think that we'll see a third intifada as a result of this mass hunger strike and mass
protest?
Well,
everything is expected nowadays in Palestine because Palestinians are united in such policies against the Israeli policies against the prisoners, and I think it is very clear case of the Palestinian prisoners and all the Palestinians, Arabs and Muslims and international community who are with justice and freedom are supporting
Right.
such a case of the Palestinians.
All right, Professor Mohsen Saleh from Zaytuna Center for Studies. I want to thank you very much for being with us. Ms. Garen Gold, journalist, joining us in London. I want to thank you also. We're also joined by Mr. Isam Yunus, director of Al Mizan Center for Human Rights, joining us from Gaza. Our email is metoday@presstv.com. Stay with Press TV. Goodbye for now.